It's a surprise, Julie. We're going with Mom, my husband said confidently as he walked through the door. I looked at him and his happy mother, completely shocked. This was supposed to be our honeymoon, so hearing that his mom was coming along was the last thing I expected. I didn't know how to respond, but before I could say anything, my husband looked annoyed and asked, "What's wrong? Aren't you happy?" Of course, I wasn't. He should have known that. I had complained to him many times about the bad relationship between me and his mother. She couldn't stand me because she felt I had taken her beloved son away. Every time we met, she'd make sarcastic comments, but she acted like the perfect mom when my husband was around. So, he never believed me when I said she was difficult. Yet, he still thought it was a good idea to bring her on our honeymoon. What was he thinking? I asked him if he had booked her flight and hotel room. He seemed confused and said, "I thought I'd do it later." I raised my voice, telling him it was impossible to get a reservation last minute during peak season, especially since we booked ours so far in advance. He just snorted and said, "Then give us your ticket." At first, I didn't understand, so I asked him again. He repeated, annoyed, "If my mom can't come, then give her your ticket. I paid for the trip, so I have the right to decide." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. His mother stood there, looking smug, and I was completely stunned. How could he think this was okay? This wasn't just any trip, it was our honeymoon. I never thought he'd invite his mom on such a special occasion. I wouldn't even want to go on a regular trip with my mother-in-law. As I stood there, surprised, she had a smug look on her face, clearly happy that her son was putting her first. "Come on, hurry up. There shouldn't be a problem since I paid for it," my husband said. Does he really think that just because he paid for the trip, he can do whatever he wants? As I thought about this, the cost of the trip popped into my mind. By the way, my name is Julie. I'm 31 years old and work at a company run by my father. At first, people thought I only got the job because of my family, but I worked hard and soon enough, people began to respect me. Even so, some still gossip about me because of my family's business, and it does hurt sometimes. In moments like these, my husband Scott has always been my support. We're the same age and worked closely as colleagues before we started dating. Scott is great at his job, and my father noticed his hard work and contributions. When we told my dad we were getting married, he was really happy. He said, "Scott, I've heard good things about you. Take care of my daughter." My husband replied, "Of course, I'll make her happy." Watching that moment made me feel so proud. At the time, my dad was thinking about passing the business on to the next generation, and some people thought Scott might be the next president of the company. Though my dad hadn't directly said anything, we had many conversations about business management over dinner, so we had an idea that it might happen one day. Scott's father passed away years ago, and his mother lives alone in their family home. He loves his mom deeply, and when we were dating, if she needed anything, he'd drop everything and go help her right away. Since she raised him by herself, I always supported his dedication to her with a smile. I admired how much he respected his mother and was proud to be with someone like him. But ever since we got married and started living together, I've started to have doubts. "I'm going to see Mom for a bit," has become his usual line, and he goes to visit her every week. Is his mother sick? I asked my husband, feeling worried. "Is your mom okay?" He replied, "No, Julie, don't worry. It's just important to spend some time alone with her sometimes." At first, he was kind when he said this, but lately, he hasn't been as nice about it. One Monday morning, as he was happily humming a tune, I asked, "Are you going to your mom's house today?" His mood changed instantly. He stopped what he was doing, took a deep breath, and asked, "Why do you say it like that?" He looked irritated, which surprised me. I shrugged, thinking maybe my tone sounded a little accusing without meaning to. "It's already been said." He glared at me, adding, "Mom is lonely by herself. I go because you have trouble getting along with her. Understand?" His words made me feel upset. Yes, it's true I have issues with my mother-in-law, but it wasn't always that way. I wanted to appreciate the woman who raised the man I love. I sincerely tried to be kind to her, but she didn't return the same feelings. From the start, she saw me as the woman who took her son away. The first time I met her, she acted cold the moment my husband left the room. Her friendly face turned serious, and she looked me up and down, judging me. So, you're the president's daughter. You don't seem like much, she said. I was shocked by how different she was when Scott wasn't there. She continued with more harsh words. You dared to show up here after stealing Scott from me. Don't think for a second I accept you. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Then, she made a rude slurping sound with her tea, not offering me any. When I nervously addressed her as mother-in-law, she snapped, Don't call me that. It's unpleasant. I couldn't understand why she was being so hostile, especially since we had just met. When I tried to speak up, she immediately shut me down. I felt helpless. Soon, I heard Scott's footsteps returning, and suddenly, her attitude changed again. She smiled sweetly, offered tea, and acted like nothing had happened. Sorry I forgot to offer you tea, she said, laughing lightly as Scott entered the room. Mother, you didn't serve the tea yet? Scott asked. Your fiancé is so charming, she said with a smile, then turned to me and added, Julie, feel free to call me mother-in-law anytime. A chill ran down my spine. Since then, my mother-in-law has continued to say hurtful things to me, but only when Scott isn't around. It's like she has two sides to her. My husband doesn't seem to see her true nature no matter what. When I talk to him about it, he just brushes it off, saying, My mother would never do that. He adds, If you're that uncomfortable, you don't have to meet her. He doesn't believe me at all. At first, I tried hard to explain, but eventually I got tired of him always defending his mom. Now, I only visit her when absolutely necessary. My husband probably thinks I hate her. Make sure to lock the door when you leave, he said, and just like always, he left without looking back. I tried to call out, Wait, but he was already gone. His figure blurred as tears filled my eyes. After our argument about his mother, he hasn't been coming home much. Sometimes it feels like his mother is more important to him than I am. Aside from the issues with his mom, Scott is a great husband. He helps me when I'm stressed about work and even does his share of the house chores, even though he's busy with his own job. At least he agrees we don't need to visit her more than necessary. Thinking about all of this, I flip through travel brochures. I try to shake off the negative thoughts and focus on our upcoming honeymoon. I'm excited about this trip. It'll be a chance to forget about his mom for a while and enjoy some time together. No unexpected calls from her. I start thinking about possible destinations, keeping in mind that Scott just became the team leader for a new project. I'd love to treat ourselves to something a little luxurious on this trip. But then I remember what Scott said. I left all the planning to you, but I want the payment to come from my account. I had wanted us to split the cost of the honeymoon, but he just laughed it off and didn't want to listen. It didn't feel right for him to pay for everything, so I decided to cover part of it myself. Being the president's daughter, I knew my mother-in-law's sarcastic comments about spending too much would only get worse. That thought made me smile wryly. Just as I had resolved to stay positive, my mother-in-law popped back into my mind. Enough of this, I told myself. To change my mood, I put the brochure aside and started preparing dinner for my husband, who would be home soon. Then the morning of our honeymoon arrived. As I was busy getting things ready, the doorbell suddenly rang. Yes, come in, I said, opening the door. I was shocked by what I saw. There she stood, my mother-in-law, dressed in flashy clothes, with a large suitcase in hand. Before I could even process it, my husband peeked out and said, Mom, you're early. He smiled at her, while she didn't even look at me. I stood there, unable to hide my confusion. I asked, Early? What do you mean? Just as we were about to leave for our honeymoon, I saw her large suitcase. What could it mean? Was she planning to stay at our house during our honeymoon? Troubled by this thought, my husband happily announced, It's a surprise. Mom is coming with us. I couldn't hide my shock, and a strange sound escaped me. What are you thinking? I asked. Wait, what does this mean? I was still in disbelief when my husband, full of excitement, repeated, It's a surprise. Mom is coming along. As I stood there, completely confused, he proudly put his arm around his mother's shoulder and said, It'll be more fun with Mom. My mother-in-law smiled at me, and I asked, Wait a minute, isn't a honeymoon supposed to be just for the couple? Shouldn't we have at least discussed this beforehand? I tried to stay calm, even though I knew I wasn't wrong. My husband, however, didn't seem to understand why I was upset. Why couldn't we see eye to eye? To make things worse, my mother-in-law seemed to be enjoying my discomfort, humming to herself. I couldn't believe this was happening on the day we were supposed to leave for our honeymoon. Why would you do something like this as a surprise? I asked angrily. My husband responded, "It's fine because I paid for everything, right?" He frowned, noticing my shock. "No, it's not fine," I said, realizing that his offer to pay for the trip wasn't to make me feel better, but to avoid any complaints about bringing his mom along. "That's not going to work," I objected, which made both my husband and his mother look unhappy. "Why won't it work?" he asked, while my mother-in-law taunted, "Julie doesn't want to travel with me, does she?" I felt a headache coming on. "That's not the point, Scott. What about your mom's plane ticket? Is the hotel booked?" I asked. My husband looked confused and said, "I thought we could book it later." "That's impossible." I raised my voice. "When do you think we booked our tickets and hotel? There's no way you can book flights and hotels now, especially during a busy holiday season." The hotel we chose wasn't too fancy, but it was decent, and it's fully booked. As I continued explaining, my husband said, "Then can you give us all your tickets?" For a moment, I didn't understand what he meant. "If there's no ticket for my mother, then give me yours. I paid for the trip, so I have the right to do that," he repeated, clearly annoyed. I was stunned. My mother-in-law looked smug, and I was left in disbelief. What was I hearing? My husband continued, "My mom went through the trouble of getting ready, so I've decided it'll just be the two of us. We can go on another trip with you later." I couldn't believe how easily he chose his mother over me. What was he thinking? "It's okay if I'm not there," I said again. "This is supposed to be our honeymoon, just me and my husband." I couldn't accept handing over our plans to my mother-in-law, who appeared out of nowhere. My husband kept saying his mother had prepared for the trip, but that didn't matter. If he wanted to keep the peace, she should step back. Yet, I was shocked as he continued to push me to give up. "Come on, hurry up. There shouldn't be a problem since I paid for it," he said. I felt a headache coming on and sighed deeply. "Actually, I was going to keep this a secret," I said. "But my father is the one paying for this trip, not you. So, it doesn't make sense for you to demand the tickets, does it?" My husband looked confused, like he couldn't believe what I was saying. He thought he had paid for everything, which is why he felt so entitled. "Why would your father do that?" he asked, surprised. I stared at him coldly. "My father paid for the honeymoon as a gift, so we could save money for our future. He even told me to keep it a secret because of your pride." "Why did you keep this from me?" my husband shouted, his face turning red with anger. My mother-in-law was just as shocked to hear my father had covered the costs. As I listened to my husband's angry words, I felt my patience running out. I had put up with my mother-in-law's behavior, and my husband always siding with her for far too long. "If you two want to go on the trip, return the money to my father and make your own arrangements," I said coldly. "Cancel the reservations and pay for it yourselves." Without waiting for their response, I grabbed my bags and left the house. This was no joke. It wasn't right for them to use my father's money. Since I had handled all the bookings, everything was in my name. I quickly canceled the flights and hotel and got into a taxi. Instead of heading to the airport, I told the driver to take me to my parents' house. When I arrived at home, dragging my suitcase behind me, my father was shocked to see me. After I explained everything, his face turned red with anger. "What kind of story is this? Is this some sort of joke?" he fumed. The constant calls from my husband only made my father angrier. I was furious too. This whole situation made me realize what I needed to do. "Dad, I'm thinking about getting a divorce," I said, my voice steady but filled with emotion. My father calmed down, and instead of saying anything, he gently comforted me, stroking my back. "I'm sorry, Dad," I whispered through my tears. He held my hand firmly. The next day, my husband showed up at my parents' house with a box of sweets as an apology. I was about to turn my husband away at the gate when my father stepped in. "If you're thinking about divorce, we need to talk properly. Let's hear what he has to say," my father suggested. Even though I had planned to consult a lawyer, I followed his advice and let my husband in. As soon as my husband saw my father, he started apologizing right away. I felt annoyed seeing him act innocent in front of my dad. As he kept saying sorry, I sighed, and my father asked me to take him to the sitting room. My apologies for causing trouble, President, my husband said, bowing his head even before we had finished greeting each other. He often called my father President, even in private, claiming it had become a habit. But when he did, he always seemed to slip into a businesslike attitude. His practiced way of apologizing felt fake. What exactly are you apologizing for? My father asked, sighing. He was as frustrated as I was. My husband just kept saying, "I'm sorry for the trouble," over and over. It wasn't an apology to me, it felt more like an insult. When he tried to explain himself, I cut him off and handed him the divorce papers. "Do you know how to fill these out? I've already completed my part. Please look it over." I spoke calmly but firmly. My husband turned pale as he stared at the papers. "Wait, Julie, divorce?" He looked at me seriously for the first time since he'd arrived. "I've always come second to you, Scott. That should be fine, right? You have your mother." I was ready to handle this like a business deal, refusing any attempts to patch things up. "What are you talking about? Why bring my mother into this?" he protested. "She was excited about the trip too. We can go on another one together, Julie." Shocked by how little he understood, I replied, "Another trip? What does that even mean? This was supposed to be our honeymoon." I was shaking, biting my lip in frustration. What kind of husband brings his mother on a honeymoon? Where does that even happen? But instead of realizing his mistake, Scott doubled down. "It was just a suggestion to bring her. At first, you said there were no flights or hotels available," he said. I couldn't believe it. "How could you even think that was a reasonable idea at the last minute?" I asked. He still didn't get it. Scott raised his voice, showing his anger. "Are you saying we should send my mother back, even though she was looking forward to this trip?" At that point, my father stepped in again, calming the situation. "Let's stop this now," he said, his voice steady. After a long silence, he shook his head in disappointment. "Scott," he said quietly. "I'm really disappointed," my father said. Scott, hearing this, immediately straightened up and addressed him as President. My father looked at him with deep sadness and disappointment. After a heavy silence, my father asked, "Why did you choose your mother over Julie in a situation like this?" The question hit Scott hard. He started stammering, struggling to find the right words. Well, he was clearly nervous, sweating as he tried to answer. While Scott could be assertive with me, he could never stand up to my father. My father continued, "A honeymoon is meant for the couple. You could have taken your mother on a trip any time after that, right? Didn't you say you loved my daughter?" Scott quickly shouted, "I'm not lying. I just wanted to show my mother she's as important as Julie." At this sudden outburst, my father looked at him sternly for the first time. "Even if it makes Julie sad? Is that okay?" my father pressed. Scott stammered again, trembling before finally saying, "I'm sorry." But the way he clenched his fists showed that his apology was more out of pride and humiliation than genuine regret. He was apologizing because my father was angry, not because he truly believed he had done something wrong. "Scott, you are a capable person," my father said, and for a moment, Scott looked relieved. But then he realized he had misunderstood. My father's expression became cold and stern. "But even if you're good at your job, a person who doesn't cherish their family can never be trusted." My father handed Scott a pen, a gesture that made Scott visibly shiver with fear. "You should not be apologizing to me," my father said firmly, pushing the pen into Scott's hand. Shaken, Scott turned to me, pleading desperately, "Julie, please, don't go through with the divorce. I'll change, I promise." He fell to his knees, clinging to my legs, begging. "I will prioritize Julie from now on," he vowed, but his words felt hollow, as if he was only saying what he thought I wanted to hear. Then, out of nowhere, Scott blurted, "Please, if we divorce, I won't be able to pay off the debts." "Debts?" I asked, confused. "What are you talking about?" I repeated, stunned by this new information. Suddenly, Scott recoiled, covering his mouth, realizing he had said too much. He looked filled with regret. My father and I just stood there, silently staring at him in disbelief. Finally, after a long pause, Scott nervously began. "Well, it's about," he hesitated, clearly terrified to continue. But when he did, the truth shocked us both. Scott revealed that he and his mother had been confident that he would eventually take over as president of my father's company. Because of this, they had been spending recklessly, believing the company's wealth would soon be theirs. The reason he visited his mother's house so often was to indulge in a lavish lifestyle with her. "The more I hear, the less I see any reason for you to stay married to this man, Julie," my father said, disgusted and too disappointed to say more. Scott, realizing how serious the situation had become, started pleading, "Please wait. If we get divorced, how will I live starting tomorrow?" His endless apologies started to sound robotic, like a toy stuck on repeat, almost comical in their desperation. "That's not our concern," I replied coldly, waiting for Scott to sign the divorce papers. There was no point in talking anymore, so my father and I quietly decided to have some coffee, not bothering to offer any to Scott. In the end, the divorce was finalized without much trouble. My father had hired an excellent lawyer, and the detailed diary I had kept helped the process go smoothly. We also requested alimony to cover the costs of the canceled honeymoon. When Scott's side asked for a reduction, my father immediately refused, and I couldn't help but laugh at how firm he was. Rumors of our divorce spread quickly at the company, and the atmosphere around Scott changed completely. It became so uncomfortable for him that he decided to resign. Since it was his choice to leave, he didn't receive much severance pay. He had to use his small savings to cover the alimony and pay off his debts. Now, he's living a very modest life. As for his mother, she has fallen ill and is bedridden. There are stories going around that Scott is working part-time jobs and asking former colleagues for financial help, but who knows if they're true. These tales have become jokes people share at parties. As for me, my father has finally decided to retire, and with strong support from the employees, it looks like I will take over as president of the company. At first, I hesitated to take on such a big role, but seeing my father's rare moment of vulnerability, wanting to trust the company to someone reliable, gave me a new sense of determination. I now feel the responsibility to live up to his expectations. Though I was unsure about leading, it seems I've inherited my father's talent for management. With his guidance as chairman, the company's performance is steadily improving. With this new confidence, I've been getting more attention at various CEO events. I haven't thought much about starting a new relationship, but maybe the time is coming for a new chapter in my life.